part 2 of our existentialism episode. The absurd, where existentialism is today, and our final thoughts and comments.
I think the main thing that Camus contributed to the existentialist sphere, and he didn't call himself an existentialist, mind you, he rejected the label. He said, je ne suis pas existentialiste. That's what he said famously. And, yeah, GCSE French, which I did not take, by the way. But, um, yeah, but, essentially, his main criticism of the existentialist, because Camus was a critic of the existentialists. He didn't disagree with their claims. He just didn't agree with it as a solution to the world's problems, because he ultimately saw this idea of the absurd, which is that he recognized this problem with the absurd, which is humans will always question things, but the world will never answer them, and as such, we're constantly looking for answers when we'll never get them, and as such, we're always going to be dissatisfied. We're never going to find our true meaning in life because there is no source for that meaning. In a sense, there'll be no answer.
Yeah.
And that criticism of existentialism Camus made was that he divided essentially existentialist thought into several categories, which was he saw many people. Well, this is vague in the way I'm explaining it right now, but if we go back to Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard was actually the first to recognize this problem of the absurd, of us constantly asking questions but the world never answering. And Kierkegaard was really close to Camus' ideas, but the last step, Kierkegaard said, I am not going to accept the absurd, I'm going to reject it by moving to the transcendental. I'm going to run away from the problem of the absurd by believing in a God that will finally give meaning to my existence.
Oh no,
So
no,
if you
sorry.
want
I
to
thought
contribute.
I thought you were sorry. I thought you were talking about Sartre there for a second. I was like, don't think you believed in a god, but yeah,
Kierkegaard.
I kind of zoned out for a second. I didn't realize who you were
No, it's
talking
fine.
about.
But yeah, Camus saw many existentialists as doing something called philosophical suicide, which was running away from the problem of the absurd by trying to transcend this world with vague, um, irrational beliefs, such as what he believed was using the transcendental and God to try and give meaning to life, rather than accepting that life has no true meaning. So that was one of his criticisms, and that the absurd is basically Camus' big idea. He also talked about this idea that suicide is the only truly serious philosophical issue, because Camus didn't even consider himself a philosopher. He didn't like the idea that philosophy was constantly running after the rational and the abstract and developing theories and never improving lives. Remember Marx's famous quote, which is, "The philosophers have only."
I think it's
What's the
the
quote?
philosophers have only interpreted the world, but the point is to change it.
To change it, and Camus very much believed in that. He wanted his philosophy, at least, to drive change and motivation in people, and that's what he tried to do with this idea of the absurd. He said that suicide is a way of running away from the absurd, but ultimately it's also the most absurd thing possible, because if one runs away from the inherent meaninglessness of the universe by committing suicide, one's allowing that meaningless to take control of them, to become their inner self, and to destroy them. And so Camus rejected both suicide and the notion of philosophical suicide. And on top of this, he also rejected this idea of, because when confronting the absurd, one can run away from it completely and stop living, because one may realize that life is nothing but a habit. But that is in turn becoming absurd and allowing oneself to become meaningless. So that suicide is not an option. Philosophical suicide is not an option, because one runs away from the issue, from going into the irrational and believing in transcendental beings. That's not an option. But there's also the option of trying to ignore the absurd and doing nothing with one's life, being lazy and being depressed. And in a sense, Camus also saw this as death on earth. If you're not doing anything with your life, you are also not, well, it's not, is it any different to death? And so Camus proposed, actually what we need to do is we need to accept that life is inherently meaningless and that we'll never find a meaning. And we need to use that to motivate us. We need to spend every second of our lives defying the absurd. We can just stop trying to look for meaning. We don't need to constantly ask questions every 5 seconds about this or that or why are we here, because we'll never get the answer. And if we constantly question, we'll be dissatisfied. And that's what Camus was saying. Just essentially enjoy life, defy the absurd. But an issue here actually is that a lot of people turned around and said, Camus, in a sense, aren't you just an existentialist then? Because what you've begun to do is, Camus used this analogy of Sisyphus, which we were talking about, the myth of Sisyphus. It was one of his famous books. I think it might have been his first non-fiction book, Camus. Camus talks about the absurd in terms of Sisyphus, which is this guy who has a boulder at the bottom of the hill, and every day he's forced to drive this boulder up to the top of the hill, only to see it fall back to the bottom again, and that he repeats this cycle every day. And Camus said that suicide's not an option. You can't just stop pushing the boulder, because then one's accepting that the boulder has dominated the individual and made one meaningless. One cannot hope for there to be something at the top of the hill if it's going to roll back down again. That's philosophical suicide and Kierkegaard believing in a god. And a lot of people said, Camus, aren't you just worshipping the acts of pushing the boulder then? Aren't you finding joy in pushing the boulder? And Camus said, no, why would I? He famously said he would, why would I deify that which crushes me? Because the absurd does crush the individual. It leaves one dissatisfied, it leaves one depressed when one realizes the absurd. And Camus did not worship the act of pushing the boulder. He merely found joy in resisting it and saying, you know what, this boulder wants me to push it, and I'm going to do it because I don't really care anymore. I accept it, but at the same time I'm going to
I
try and
think
defy
the
it.
I think
And
one of the best thing is he laughs with scorn at the boulder rather than letting it be
yeah,
greater than him.
yeah, and that's just basically his idea of and his approach to life. And this actually was quite influential at the time, in the sense that it inspired a lot of people who were very depressed at the time to actually keep living. And in that sense, Camus was very resolved, because that was his main goal as a philosopher. He didn't want to be a philosopher. He wanted to be someone who changed and helped
Well, that was
people.
one of the that was one
And
of his separation from Sartre. Sartre was very actually really agreed with Camus because he felt that Sartre, that is, felt that he himself hadn't really achieved very much in actually changing the world. Especially and he was almost envious of Camus' kind of proletarian background even, even though Sartre had a wonderful life. And he wanted to change things like Camus did, and he got more involved in that kind of activism later on.
yeah,
But Camus was definitely, he lived his philosophy to the max almost.
yeah, um, and yeah, Camus had a lot of other issues with existentialists. Of course, as I said before, he didn't reject existentialism, because he didn't reject all of it. He still believed it was fundamentally correct, and he said himself that there's no truth. There are only truths, which is the idea that there is no it links back to the idea that there's no objective interpretation of the world. And but he did have some issues with existentialists, and he, for example, criticized Sartre's Marxism and Sartre's because Marxism, of course, was linked to the deification of history and the issue of man is limited by his historical and social context. And Camus said, no, in this realm of Marxism, man should not only be limited by the historical and social context, because that strips man of his ability to create his own history, and that instead man should be interpreted as one who creates his own history. And this is where he split with Sartre on some things as Marxism. But of course, throughout this entire movement, we've had a history of collectivism, and Camus was no exception. He was he was an anarcho-syndicalist at the time, and he did sympathize with that type of politics because he saw it as a solution to the issue of the world. And in order to be happy, he saw that people had to be as free as possible to be able to express their free will. And that links into the idea of human solidarity and politics at the time. But yeah, I think we've covered most of the stuff about Camus. If you have anything
No,
else
I
to
think
add.
you've done a very good job. Right, we are over an hour mark now, though we may have to get rid of the stuff when I was left the call.
Your
Yes,
internet.
my
It's fine.
internet,
Don't worry.
the hero of this podcast. Um,
It's fine, don't worry.
But we are going to get on to where is existentialism and its impact. So, I suppose the biggest thing to say is that, today we don't hear many existentialists, and its impact on academic philosophy it's not been negligible, but it's been relatively small in terms of who the people with power in philosophy haven't really accepted very much of it. Nonetheless, it's had a big impact, especially on art, psychology, and it's kind of filtered into the public conscious. I mean, it's one of the most famous schools of philosophy, certainly, and there's loads and loads and loads of people who have read at least some of the work. I mean, my gran is not really very much of a not well, she is, but she wouldn't necessarily sit down and read many philosophical texts. Nonetheless, she has read The Second Sex, which is de Beauvoir's feminist existentialism, and the Myth of Sisyphus you've read, and it was very, very popular in the 60s. There was a big movement around it, more of a cultural movement than a
Yeah.
philosophical one, but it certainly had its impacts in that way. So especially expressionism was very much influenced by existentialism and the whole idea of the subjective individual. And as well, the emotionality of it is very important because there's plenty of one of the biggest things, perhaps what we haven't mentioned so much, is that existentialism of all philosophies is very, very emotional. It relates to human consciousness not as this objective honoring system, where you just see everything in a one cold light, but rather it views us as beings who have these feelings, and that they conquer rationality more than rationality conquers them. And then there's impacted psychology. Freud was indebted to Nietzsche really for the analysis of the role of psychology within culture and history, and for the view of cultural artifacts like drama, music, documenting psychological tensions. Of course, the thing is that in effect, psychoanalysis kind of undermines some of the tenets of existentialism, as we'll get onto in our kind of analysis towards the end. But do you want to talk about the philosophical impact, Sully?
Philosophically, yeah. So existentialism in the 20th century was pretty much born from Husserl's
Phenomenology. Do do do
phenomenology,
do do.
and
Sorry,
phenomenology
you know.
phenomenology continues today, and it's still very strong. And it, uh, as phenomenology influenced existentialism, existentialism influenced phenomenology, and that's quite interesting. And by the way, if you don't know what phenomenology is, it's just the study of existence from a first person's perspective. Um, it's very similar to existentialism, but it's more abstract, I'd say, in nature, with this idea of intentionality or whatever else. But essentially, phenomenology still lives on and was contributed to by existentialism, which we generally see as more of a cultural movement, to be fair, nowadays. But also, uh, a lot of existentialist thinkers at the time, who were friends with people like Sartre, um, went into institutions like the Frankfurt School, and the Frankfurt School has been massively influential on modern philosophy and modern political thought. So existentialism, in a sense, the echoes of it have seeped into modern consciousness, and also in just general public consciousness. Though we might not talk about existentialism, you don't really go to a random person and say, "Do you know? Are you familiar with the ideas of the absurd?" They'll just say no.
That's absurd, they might
If
say.
you ask, if you go to if you go to any atheist though, most of them will, if you ask them, "Why do you live?" Most of them will say, "I don't really know why I live. Does there need to be a reason why I live? I just kind of live life to enjoy it." And the reason why atheists nowadays generally believe that, and why it's just public sentiment, is because of the existentialist movement. In the 20th century, people were scared to admit that maybe there is no meaning to life and we just live life to pursue our own individual joys. But now it's common knowledge,
Yeah,
right?
it kind of
So,
existentialism has kind of taken away the fear that the what would happen if we let that go would be nihilism and the burning down of
exactly.
society, I suppose.
Yeah, so that influence is immeasurable. But yes, there is not much to talk about existentialism anymore because, I mean, you can always talk about something like the philosophy of mind or metaphysics of any type, but there isn't much more to add to existentialism or to the absurd, because one of the big ideas of the absurd actually is we don't need to ask so many questions because the world will never answer. And once you've accepted the absurdity of the human condition, there isn't much more to actually add to existentialism. The whole like topic is kind of done. We've covered all the issues in it. We've resolved our this issue of why do we've not resolved it, because we can never actually resolve these issues. That's what the absurd is saying. But we've kind of given a philosophical answer to it for now, and we don't really need people don't really have much more to add to the field. So that's why it's kind of drifted out of public consciousness
Yeah.
in comparison to other philosophical
And
fields.
it's very distinctive, method of philosophy, in contrast to the analytic school, which is kind of mathematical in
Yeah.
its premise, conclusion, and so on. It's very, very poetic. Existentialism is very poetic. It's very literary. The books are very long, and there's more plays and novels perhaps than a direct treatise. Or what's the treatise is? I don't know how to pronounce it.
I don't know how to pronounce it either.
The
Don't worry about it.
directly philosophical work. So I guess that makes it harder for people to. I mean, it's kind of easier for the amateur, but there's kind of perhaps a scorning of it, of as it being a philosophy for the the aesthetic,
So
humanities related person, rather than a direct academic form of work. But yeah, you can.
though
Sorry,
I
go on.
oh, sorry, I was just gonna say I think in the of course the modern analytic tradition has laughed at at the continental philosophers and their existentialism, but I think if Camus were alive today, he would laugh, back, because he does talk about, in his book The Myth of Sisyphus, he talks about how it's laughable how people try and live their lives as if everything is rational, everything is logical, everything can be done in terms of the analytic. And he says philosophy shouldn't just be about analytic statements and propositions and suppositions, presuppositions, and all this stuff. It has to be, to some extent, about one's
Yeah,
emotion, how one feels.
yeah.
So that would probably be Camus' response to the analytic tradition nowadays. But I would argue, yes, it has definitely phased out of public consciousness, and I think that's all we can really say about the role of existentialism today.
Brilliant. Okay, so we're going to get into some thoughts now. Hopefully we done be it within the next 15 minutes or so, I suppose. Well, we can chat on this forever, but we probably ought to set some time before this ends up being 3 hours long, and
But
people are going to be a bit
yeah,
bored. But right, what are your Solomon? What are your initial thoughts on existentialism? I mean, you've expressed a lot of thoughts already. What are your general opinion on it? Go.
Tom, I'll have you know, actually, the objectification of my name as Solomon is very insulting, and it doesn't allow me to use my true existence as someone called Sully, and to define my own essence. So,
You're not going to respond until I call you.
anyway,
Okay, Sully,
uh,
you go. No.
anyway. So, in regards to my thoughts on existentialism, I think it's liberating, because every child or every person will one day ask the question of why am I here? And even in the contexts that Camus provides of the 9 to 5 job, which can be extremely tiring, one will start to realize, why am I doing all this? Is life worth it? And I think existentialism sort of was a way to motivate people and to alleviate people of their sorrows, and to that's why the cultural movement was so strong in the 20th century, because it was so motivating, it was so revolutionary, and I think that was a massive positive of the existentialist
Yeah.
movement,
Oh, sorry.
because
You go.
for too long philosophy was philosophy has always asked questions, of course, but the answers have never come from the world, so we're always in doubt and constantly worrying about what does this mean or what does that mean. And existentialism sort of gave a break from that, and saying, don't, like, even Camus' idea of the absurd, don't worry about it. There'll be thousands, millions. There's an infinite amount of questions that will never be answered in the
But
world,
you
and
have to build it for yourself.
we have to deal
Yeah.
with that. Yeah, we have to deal with that. And though you may like in asking questions, don't think that you're constant. Don't think that though it might be nice for you in the moment to have a overarching purpose to your life and meaning. Don't always worry about having an explicit meaning to your life. Just kind of live life to enjoy it.
Yeah, yeah. Don't.
I'd
Well,
say
I
it's
think having a meaning it's
it's
important for some of them,
important.
but not for others. Like Camus, yeah. But yeah, the whole stopping yourself rationalizing everything and trying to turn you into some automaton when you are an emotional human is very important. What I would say is, I was going to mention. Oh, it just slipped my mind. What were you? You were saying something about the. Oh yeah, I would say yes. Sorry, this is going to be a bit boring for the. This was probably a bit boring for people listening, but I think it's been very helpful for
No, no.
me, reading and listening and learning about it, because there's something I've struggled with, which is trying to provide an answer for what is the purpose of existence, and I've variously in the past described, well, it's to do reason and rationality, or it's to provide fulfilling productive labour, as perhaps Marx would say. But again, whenever you now analyse them for any length of time, even just on your own, you kind of come to the conclusion that they're kind of unsatisfactory. But the idea that you can create your own meaning, or the fact that maybe you don't even need to have a meaning at all, is very revolutionary, and it's kind of solves some of the dilemmas I've had just with my own introspection. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's a reason why it appealed to so many people in the 20th century and today, and I think it's been very powerful in that, and I'm pleased that we decided to go and read about it. Otherwise, I think I'd be missing out on a great new perspective on the way we live. Have you got anything else to add, Sully?
In in the realm of positives, I don't think I could think of any more. But yeah, I do generally have a good like I see it as a good ideology. I just don't have any other reasons right now
Mm-hmm.
for why yeah, so I think it's a great idea.
So, in terms of negatives or criticisms, perhaps, I mean, one of the biggest ones is around this doctrine of freedom. Are we really free? So, of course, you have what's called the questions of determinism or libertarianism, and that's not libertarianism as in round up the
Ayn
Ayn Rand,
Rand,
yeah, or just let the poor starve. That's libertarianism.
or just like
Yeah, it's
political.
not political
Yeah.
libertarianism. You see, we may be a little bit biased against it here, and giving our glowing reporting on, well, not glowing, but more than pleasurable, more pleasing reviews of Camus and Sartre. You may see a little bit of our politics creeping through, but nonetheless. The fact is that to many people, we are not really free. We are down to the atomic level, down to minute atomic reactions, and then chemical, and so on, and they produce who we are. We are not really acting out of our own free will so much as we are the victim, or the one that suffers from these thoughts and these actions that aren't really kind of beyond our control. And if that's the case, then trying to live authentically is impossible. You could feel like you're living authentically, or you're trying to move that way, but really you're not, because you're not the one living that life. You are being governed by material rules and such. And Sartre doesn't really. He does cover it a bit, but I think that answers to whether we have free will are kind of unsatisfactory, and may and often are, well, even if we don't have free will, we should act as if we are, which is a useful thing on its own merits, but I feel like they should have perhaps gone into more depth on that, since it's so important to their philosophy as a whole. Do you have anything
Yeah,
else?
I'd have to definitely. Yeah, I'd have to definitely agree with that criticism because I personally um, follow some sort of hard determinist, nomological determinist perspective of the world, I see everything as ultimately being governed by laws of physics, atoms interacting. I see everything built up from particles that obey laws of physics. But so in that sense, free will becomes obsolete, and that is one of my issues with existentialism, because how can we, when they talk about transcending one's facticity, and the conditions that uh, define one's consciousness and one's ability to act freely, I don't think one can truly escape those influences. I think that one ultimately it just follow their body. They may feel they are free inside. All of their atoms are following laws of physics essentially, and that does clash with the main tenet of existentialism. The presupposition that we all are free. Um, but also I do kind of see a solution to that can be reconciled with existentialism, and that is that perhaps we as humans may not be free from the perspective of the atom from physics, but because we are limited in knowledge and can only see the world from a human perspective, we have to just kind of pretend like we have free will rather than acknowledge that maybe we don't have free will, because there's no way for us to act deterministically, because we're kind of outside of that realm, right? Human thought, as existentialist thinkers would say, human thought is outside of,
Hmm.
we can't
Yeah.
describe it in rational terms. So trying to use terms like determinism and free will doesn't really work, because even if we are even if all of our actions are determined by laws of physics, we feel and act as if we're free, and that we should maybe just follow in principle and be ignorant and pretend we are free. And as such, existentialism can still hold
Yeah,
in
and
that
I
regard.
suppose that even if we are, if we look at it from consciousness and this view of intentionality, perhaps, even if we are just following these laws when we interpret something as that, we still are interpreting this as pretty or heavy or the like, and we still do these actions for a purpose, even if that purpose is just reactions or neurons firing because of whatever. So yeah, I think yeah, it still has its merits on that. One of the interesting things, and I would want to explore this further, is how existentialism would relate to if we brought it more into the more practical side of philosophy, in my opinion at least, which is ethics and political philosophy. So obviously they spent a lot of time talking about socialism and anarcho-syndicalism and the like, and of course, but de Beauvoir was a well-known feminist and wrote about ethics. But I think what would happen if everyone followed, if we go by a Kantian maxim of everyone following this, everyone has to follow it in order for it to be able to be moral. And I know that goes against existentialist thoughts, but bear with for a second. If everyone, tried to live authentically, then we would be left today, at least, we'd be left in a society where some people would have their freedom and their ability to act authentically
Oh,
impinged by
definitely,
others.
definitely.
That's the whole point of why they supported left wing political ideals, where everyone came to it of their own volition. But yeah, I think that the consequence is that you'd have to fight for some sort of revolution and post scarcity economy. I think before these could be applied, and we could reach a state in which there is not this. There's the human freedom is at its utmost, I suppose. Yeah,
Yeah,
and as well, another thing is de Beauvoir being a feminist, and she supported abortion, but that's interesting if we look at how perhaps abortion objectifies this baby with the, or not baby but embryo with the potential of becoming a human. I mean, I don't think, even though I've accepted some tenets of existentialist thought, I'm not going to start arguing against abortion. I don't think, but I think it raises some more questions that could be developed on more. And it's just one issue, but there are the way in which it deals with life and death is interesting to me. And I just abortion was the one that stood out as the premier social and civil issue of our time, perhaps. What do you want to
Yeah.
say, Sully?
I don't have much to say, but I'll try and comment on what you've said. I think from the issue of abortion, maybe the solution is to look again to existentialism and interpret it differently, because obviously we all interpret differently. But existentialism values. Is everything okay, Tom?
Oh yeah, it's fine. Sorry.
Okay. Existentialism values above all else the will of the human, the freedom, right? And in that sense, one could also argue that not being able to abort a child is yet another layer of facticity and a restriction to one's liberties, and as such, one could actually argue for abortion from a existentialist standpoint in trying to liberate
Yes,
oneself.
yes, certainly. Yeah.
And and also one could argue that de Beauvoir always talks about the limits of one's essence, and being able to abort allows a woman to be free of, well, because men don't have to bear children, but women do.
Hmm.
So abortion allows one to exceed their essence in the sense that they can stop being
Yeah.
limited by
By their
having to
reproduction.
carry a
Yeah.
baby after.
But I think
Yeah,
I think as well. The other flip of what I said was that the you objectify the embryo, whatever. But at the same time, the embryo
yeah,
objectifies you. It portrays its own.
exactly.
It encompasses part of you and becomes you when really they're separate. So it's an interesting thing. I think the consequences are very intriguing, and they could be
Yeah,
worked on perhaps in the future when we're perhaps more able to do more thought on that thing. But if
yeah,
there's not much else we want to say, then I suppose we ought to probably wrap it up. Then it's good. We're almost at
yeah. I
90
mean,
minutes. But no, you
that
you
is
speak.
true.
It doesn't matter how long it is exactly. But
Okay. I mean, only other thing I was going to say is that I definitely agree with the idea of society. If everyone tried to live authentically, it would require a radical transformation of society. Because one of the constricting factors of our obviously liberal capitalist system is that we essentially force people into unfavorable positions through socioeconomic conditions. We force people to be bin men through poverty and through they have no
well,
other option. And in a sense, we
well,
use
yeah,
poverty as a
we
form
force
of
people into
coercion.
jobs that they may not otherwise take through coercion. Yeah,
Yeah,
not that there's anything wrong
and
with
that
being a
would
bin man. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. No, I'm not.
But most people
Of
don't
course.
choose their job
But that would
authentically. Yeah.
so 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 if everyone lived authentically, what would happen to this issue of bin men, for example? And that was obviously an important issue to people like the anarchists at the time, and of course that means that society would have to radically transform to meet demands in different ways. And that's why there was this political revolution. People saying we cannot be authentic in this capitalist system, which uses coercion and uh, essentially limits us to our socioeconomic positions as our essence rather than our existence, and that's why there
Yes,
was that
definitely. Yeah, yeah.
shift.
You become something else. In society you are living in bad faith. The waiter in Sartre has this metaphor of a cafe. Well, not a metaphor, but example of a cafe. The waiter becomes a waiter and is acting in bad faith because they did not choose that out of their own conscience, but they were kind of forced into it by the circumstances in which they live. So yeah, the consequences would
Yeah,
be very interesting to discuss, and you can see why they supported the collectivist forms of politics, I suppose. So then, I think I think we could perhaps conclude by saying that. I mean, I'll conclude by saying I've really enjoyed this, and I've really enjoyed finding out more about existentialism, and something I'd like to read more into in the future, and how it relates to modern philosophy. Um, I I think that the lives of the people that were the key thinkers of it are very interesting, and perhaps in the future we could delve into some of them in more detail in particular, or we could discuss other philosophers that we haven't mentioned that were key to it, like Jaspers or Marcel. And I'm very glad we did this, and I hope you enjoyed the first episode. But Sully, would you like to add anything else?
Um, yeah, I'd say I've really enjoyed learning about existentialism. I think it's going to inform my personal philosophy of how to approach life for a very long time from now on, and that I do really like the ideas, and I think it forms a really good case for collectivist politics, finding the individual within the
Hmm.
collective through cooperation. I think that's really interesting. That's going to inspire me to develop my sense of political philosophy more and more. And I think, yeah, I think it's had a net positive impact on the world. Um, in comparison to of course, we've almost Camus, in a sense, has achieved his goal of exceeding nihilism from within nihilism.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I think that's great.
And I would also the last thing I'm going to say is that we have got an episode going to hopefully be out in the next 2 weeks. Well, we've not recorded it yet, but we will hopefully record it in the next 2 weeks, and it's going to be on
Yeah,
ethical systems, and what the main ones are, and
yeah,
our thoughts on them. And I think that should be an interesting one, very practical. Most people, I don't think, necessarily see ethics as something they think about every day, but it is,
yeah. Hard and
yeah,
fast.
yes, but it is something that you all invoke at some point in our lives all the time, and it's
Yeah,
hopefully I think you shall enjoy that too if you enjoyed this one. So, without further ado, I suppose shall wish you a good day and a goodbye as well. So,
yeah.
brilliant. Okay, bye bye.
Goodbye. Thanks for
Thank
watching.
you.
Well, listening
Yeah, thanks
actually,
for
not
listening.
watching.
Well,
But
if you're on
yes,
YouTube, you will be watching it,
thank you.
except you won't be able to see anything.
Watching a
Yes.
still image, perhaps.
All right then.
But yes, thank you for tuning in
Thanks for
today.
listening to the New Dogs Old Tricks podcast.